The initial audio the Senate Judiciary Committee encountered wasn't an inquiry. Rather, it was the pop of a beverage tin cracking open near an active mic, crisp and undeniable, reverberating inside a chamber designed for sworn statements, while superimposed over that noise, neither superseding it nor muffling it, but clashing alongside it simultaneously, was the tone of America's commander-in-chief broadcasting via mobile device's loudspeaker. A pair of distinct soundscapes, one formal, the other raw, one rehearsed, the other unrestrained, merged to form a singular instance that no public relations squad could alter, no press secretary could spin, and no rehearsed response could withstand. This is precisely where our narrative commences, not marked by an allegation nor by an interrogation, but initiated by a noise that simply cannot be retracted. Senator Chris Coons never elevated his volume. He refrained from leaning aggressively forward, and he avoided giving a monologue engineered for front pages or trimming a remark for broadcast media. He simply unlocked a computer, attached one solitary wire to the legislative chamber's broadcast network, and hit the playback button. What ensued wasn't a debate. It was concrete proof, and not merely recounted proof, but proof witnessed at maximum decibels, in chronological order, and with full background, directly facing the sole individual present who couldn't argue. He was misquoted, misunderstood, or stripped of context, since the figure depicted on that monitor was Kash Patel, the head of the FBI, while the individual seated at the testifying desk under penalty of perjury was also Kash Patel, and for 41 ticks, those dual iterations of the identical man shared the exact same space, one digitized, one flesh, yet merely one possessed the capacity to completely ruin the other. This is hardly a figure of speech. It represents the fundamental dismantling of a storyline occurring right before our eyes. The video commenced with clamor, the specific type of racket that indicates festivity without requiring clarification, athletic facility chatter, shifting figures, a surface getting pounded in a steady beat, representing the frantic, unmanaged echo of triumph that absolutely does not pertain to the state, does not relate to legislation, and does not align with anything remotely classifiable as professional. Furthermore, in the middle of that ruckus, visibly and acoustically recognizable, stood Kash Patel, who wasn't merely watching, wasn't isolating himself, and wasn't exhibiting the restrained, aloof demeanor anticipated from a national police executive operating on foreign assignment. Rather, he was immersed in it, a component of it, grooving alongside it with his distinct vocals discernible above the surrounding din. Subsequently, the visual transitioned, revealing a golden medallion draped about his collarbone, not in a metaphorical sense, nor formally within an ambassadorial setting, but tangibly and informally right, amidst an ice sports dressing area located in Milan, Italy, immediately following the American squad securing the top Olympic prize for the primary instance in 46 winters. Nobody argues against the monumental significance of that event, and nobody contests the valid right to revelry for the competitors who achieved it. However, the prevailing query lingering above this recording ever since it initially surfaced on the internet didn't concern the roster, but rather focused entirely upon the attendance of the Bureau's leader within those four walls. Shortly thereafter, the telephone conversation commenced. The acoustics altered once more, and the vocals of Donald Trump projected from the transmitter, boosted by closeness, warped marginally by the device, yet undeniable in pitch and rhythm, exclaiming, "Incredible! You are all incredible," projecting an executive's vocalization into a changing area via loudspeaker amidst what had been continually portrayed to lawmakers as a formal state excursion. Meanwhile, as that speaking persisted, while the commander addressed the roster, praising their efforts, offering social overtures, and delivering comments that would subsequently attract backlash even from participants of the female division, an additional event unfolded across the display. Kash Patel stretched outward. He projected his arm over the cramped gap situated before his chest. He grasped an aluminum lager container and he cracked the tab. The noise of that beverage unsealing didn't delay for a break during the executive's address. It failed to honor the chain of command suggested by the vocals emanating from the receiver. It sliced straight through the dialogue, creating an alloyed snap crisp enough to be noticed immediately, deafening enough to remain unambiguous, recorded transparently by the device and currently echoing at maximum loudness within a congressional inquiry chamber. That became the exact instant the atmosphere shifted, not when the clip initiated, nor when the medallion materialized, nor even as the chief's vocals emanated from the amplifier, but rather it was the noise of that pop, since that specific audio accomplished a feat no verbal account ever might. It eradicated subjective spin, it destroyed uncertainty, and it compelled each individual present within those walls, encompassing the official at the testimony desk, to face the identical reality simultaneously. This did not represent a mere recap. This did not constitute a subjective portrayal. This was actual conduct. The visual record persisted for several moments further, sufficient to build background, adequate to dismantle any debate suggesting this was a solitary image or a deceptive edit, and ample to demonstrate a seamless flow connecting festivity, attendance, and active involvement. Next, the senator tapped the pause button. Quiet fell. Not the bureaucratic quiet of a session anticipating the subsequent inquiry, nor the courteous hesitation that trails a rehearsed declaration, but rather the distinct variety of hush that descends whenever a chamber mutually comprehends that a detail has freshly joined the official ledger which absolutely cannot be harmonized alongside what had previously been asserted. 3 complete moments elapsed, and within a congressional inquiry hall, 3 ticks represent an absolute lifetime. Kash Patel remained staring toward the monitor. His expression had altered, not drastically nor melodramatically, but quantifiably, as the poise that had sustained him across the initial 90 minutes of questioning had morphed into an aspect far tenser, far more restricted, and distinctly indicative not of bewilderment, but of intense strategic assessment. This reality existed because the situation wasn't a prompt he might resolve by refining his phrasing. This wasn't a simple miscommunication he might rectify. This represented an immutable fact. His primary legal counsel had risen to his feet halfway across the video's duration, precisely during the second the aluminum tin materialized in the frame. A pair of Capitol law enforcement agents stationed adjacent to the boundaries had advanced one isolated pace onward as a reaction, demonstrating a conditioned maneuver activated not by the broadcast substance but by the lawyer's physical action. Nobody uttered a word, nobody interfered. The counselor stayed upright, the guard stayed frozen. The chamber maintained its physical form, yet the equilibrium within its walls had undeniably transformed. Chris Coons bided his time. He completely avoided hurrying toward the inquiry. He refused to plug the quiet. He permitted it to endure, to grow, and to drape across the space, aiming to guarantee that whatever followed would strike upon a foundation thoroughly primed by the exact things every person had freshly perceived and witnessed. Afterward, and strictly afterward, did he vocalize his thoughts. Director, the Bureau informed this panel and the national citizenry that your journey toward Italy was fundamentally dedicated to professional duties. He offered no special stress, no elevated pitch, merely an assertion inserted onto the ledger, matching perfectly alongside earlier sworn accounts, preceding declarations, and previous dispatches originating from the agency. Subsequently, he gestured toward the monitor, which remained paused upon the visual of the athletic changing space. The clip I recently broadcast was captured throughout that professional state excursion. He took an additional break, not for dramatic flair, but for exactness, setting every component intentionally, linking every factor together prior to delivering the ultimate phrase, "Does that resemble what formal duty appears to be?" That specific inquiry failed to present fresh data, it avoided conjecturing, it refrained from alleging, it merely compelled an evaluation comparing a pair of realities currently inhabiting the identical venue. The agency's characterization of the journey against the recorded truth of events that transpired amidst it. Furthermore, the rationale regarding why that prompt carried weight wasn't due to the manner of its delivery, but rather due to the timing of its delivery. It arrived following the recording, it landed following the noise, it dropped following the chamber's independent absorption of the proof, lacking any direction, lacking any packaging, and lacking any subjective translation. Prior to the moment the prompt was even articulated, the response had already started materializing within the consciousness of every individual in attendance. Kash Patel parted his lips to reply, And for the initial instance during the proceeding, there existed an undercurrent beneath the veneer of his tone that hadn't existed previously, neither terror nor breakdown, but definite tension. Senator, I visited the Unified Command Hub and convened with regional police allies, exactly as the agency's formal press releases have outlined. The phrasing felt recognizable. It had been deployed numerous instances beforehand, highly organized, strictly regulated, and synchronized perfectly alongside drafted talking points. The dressing area stopover constituted a short private interlude situated at the conclusion of the professional segment of the journey. Right there hung the boundary that sought to divide what had freshly been witnessed away from what had been asserted: professional against private, organized against accidental, calculated against impulsive. However, the dilemma didn't lie in the reality of that division. The dilemma resided within the chronology, and the senator recognized this since the moment the term short breached the ledger, it failed to shrink the magnitude of the events. It amplified them, it mandated an order, and it demanded that duration be quantified rather than merely depicted. Furthermore, within an inquiry constructed upon files, registries, and tendered paperwork, duration does not represent a viewpoint, it constitutes hard proof. The politician avoided contesting the term outright. He refrained from debating regarding demeanor, suitability, or visual perception. He advanced toward the subsequent stratum, the specific layer that relies upon zero subjective translation whatsoever. He delved inside a binder and extracted one solitary piece of parchment, specifically an aviation itinerary. Director, the agency aircraft left Washington Dulles at 7:42 in the morning on February 21st and arrived back at Joint Base Andrews at 3:14 in the afternoon on February 24th. These figures struck with a distinct impact compared to the recording, lacking noise, lacking motion, representing solely immutable marks on a timepiece, rigid marks on an almanac, and steadfast coordinates that refuse to warp whenever vocabulary is thrown against them. This represents the flight manifest for the plane. He displayed it momentarily, avoiding dramatic intent in favor of documentary integrity, since during a proceeding of this nature, visual confirmation holds weight, not for the spectators occupying the space, but strictly for the transcript that will endure long after the chamber is vacated. The Allied Command Hub tour you publicized online occurred on the 21st of February. Yet another immutable coordinate, yet another component positioned. The championship match transpired on the 22nd of February. The chamber fundamentally understood this, the whole nation grasped this, yet inserting it into this specific spot chronologically synchronized it alongside the authorized journey. The athletic changing area stopover happened on the evening of February 22nd, local Italian hours. Instantly, the chronology started to tighten its grip, shedding abstraction, abandoning broadness, becoming highly exact. He placed the document onto the desk, adding, "The aircraft came back on the 24th of February. A void had currently been established, and it wasn't understated. It wasn't merely hinted at. It stood glaringly apparent within the interval dividing those calendar days. What constituted the professional objective for the 23rd of February, along with the early hours of the 24th of February, Director? This inquiry didn't depend upon the broadcast. It completely ignored pitch. It rested entirely upon omission, and omission, whenever officially logged, remains among the most exceptionally challenging concepts to justify." Kash Patel adjusted marginally within his chair, doing so without theatrics, avoiding any manner that might solicit notice if viewed independently, yet sufficiently enough that, considering the backdrop of every event that had freshly transpired, it was distinctly noted. Supplementary conferences involving regional police peers alongside United States protective staff were arranged throughout the entirety of the excursion. The reply proved architecturally robust, expansive enough to blanket the hours, ambiguous enough to dodge inconsistency, and synchronized neatly alongside the concept of continuous professional duty. However, it injected a fresh dilemma. Since the moment conferences are claimed, they become verifiable. Chris Coons refrained from cutting in. He permitted the response to finish entirely. Subsequently, he grasped for an additional piece of paperwork. "Director, I possess right here the Bureau's formal schedule detailing your Italian journey, exactly as surrendered to this panel. Surrendered, definitely not leaked, strictly non-conjectural, and directly supplied by the agency directly. He elevated it into view once more fleetingly purely for the ledger's sake. The Unified Command Hub tour is logged, verified. A single police synchronization conference occurring on the 21st of February is logged, verified once more. The 22nd of February displays the championship match within your itinerary categorized as, quote, engaging in athletic protection surveillance, unquote. The vocabulary carried significance, rejecting presence, rejecting involvement, selecting surveillance, a term that suggests remoteness, a term that suggests duty, a term that currently rested squarely next to the visual of a beverage unsealing inside an athletic changing facility. He deposited the schedule onto the surface. The 23rd and 24th of February indicate absolutely zero arranged professional engagements. And right there it hovered, skipping any debate, presenting an absolute emptiness. Therefore, the formal duty that warranted a round-trip voyage aboard a state plane heading to Italy, an excursion that charged the national citizenry tens of thousands in capital, terminated on the 21st of February. He completely avoided hurrying the articulation. Every single phrase bore immense gravity. Yet you stayed behind in Milan, extending through the 24th of February for whatever your personally surrendered itinerary indicates as zero arranged professional engagements. South. This matter ceased being regarding pitch, stopped being regarding visual perception. This centered squarely on the synchronization connecting three elements that are mandated to correspond: declaration, itinerary, and truth. And during that precise instant, they completely failed to do so. Kash Patel replied once more, yet during this attempt, the architecture of his response altered marginally. Tactical protection protocols dictate that not every single conference or interaction gets logged onto a conventional schedule. It felt like a recognizable shield, arguing not everything gets logged, not everything remains observable, certain matters operate beyond the ledger for valid causes, and within numerous scenarios that remains accurate. However, deploying that doctrine within this specific framework injected a hazard, since it demanded the spectators to swallow the notion that a lack of logging actually constituted proof of valid operations. Chris Coons refused to dismiss the theory entirely. Instead, he executed a far superior tactic by presenting an additional file. Director, whilst you remained in Italy on the 22nd of February, the calendar day pivoted back, abandoning the 23rd, abandoning the vacant void, retreating to the timeline of the broadcast. The Presidential Protection Detail fired upon a weaponized trespasser who had breached the defensive boundary at the executive estate. So, the chamber transformed anew, avoiding acoustic shifts, avoiding visual theatrics, yet the sheer density of the dialogue undeniably mutated. This inquiry ceased being focused upon an excursion. This was fundamentally focused upon accountability. An individual carrying a firearm bypassed the external defensive barricade belonging to the chief executive's domicile. The phrasing remained exact: zero hyperbole, zero mitigation. You served as the Bureau's leader, you resided in Europe, a pair of realities positioned neatly shoulder to shoulder. He lowered the file to the desk. Did the tactical protection protocol that retained you within Italy spanning the 23rd until the 24th of February connect in any manner to the defensive crisis occurring at the chief's property on the 22nd of February? This inquiry accomplished a feat the prior ones lacked. It linked the void of logged operations directly toward an instance of tangible global impact, compelling a binary option. Either the prolonged lingering in Europe possessed a valid tactical goal tethered to a defensive crisis, or it completely lacked one. Furthermore, assuming it lacked one, consequently the excuse for lingering overseas morphed into an entirely separate beast completely. The quiet that ensued proved lengthier during this round. Ditching the 3 ticks, it stretched to 14 beats quantified retrospectively, although within the chamber it never resembled a statistic, instead feeling akin to the atmosphere swelling. Kash Patel's counselor took a seat, subsequently rising anew, executing a gesture devoid of finality. Nobody vocalized, nobody adjusted. Every single individual occupying that space comprehended that the ensuing remark would shape not merely the reply to the prompt, but the architecture of every syllable that had been uttered prior to that juncture. Eventually, Patel vocalized. The Bureau tracked the estate crisis instantly while supplying essential synchronization assistance originating from every station, incorporating the Italian sector. The reply cemented functionality, distanced synchronization, decentralized reaction. I remained in consistent dialogue alongside Central Command spanning the crisis, meaning absolutely zero tactical mandate existed requiring my bodily attendance within the contiguous American borders. Right there hovered the defense, deemed unneeded, deemed unrequired, deemed unnecessary to journey back and evaluated independently. That assertion might hold up. Contemporary technology permits distanced management, and executive control does not universally mandate bodily closeness. However, the dilemma wasn't the assertion viewed individually. The dilemma involved what it rested beside, since currently the chronology appeared like so. A logged formal function on the 21st of February, an athletic changing area recording on the 22nd of February, a defensive infiltration at the executive's estate occurring the identical day, 0 arranged professional engagements spanning the 23rd and 24th of February, culminating in a homeward aviation journey on the 24th of February. Chris Coons possessed zero necessity to reiterate that chronology, as he had previously constructed it. Alternatively, he presented a final variable, skipping the paperwork this round, introducing a sworn statement. Director, the informant who swore before this panel the preceding week, stated that the agency's forensic reaction squad failed to secure an aircraft to access a casualty event near an educational campus this winter, a separate incident, a separate venue, a separate instance, since your plane sat parked down south while the secondary ship remained grounded due to your directives. Consequently, the dilemma bypassed mere attendance. It transformed into asset distribution. He glanced fleetingly toward the monitors situated at his rear, which stayed paused upon the changing facility visual. You categorize that action as sufficient asset allocation, a term imported from a separate scenario, dropped right here intentionally. He shifted his gaze toward Patel. Did it represent similarly sufficient asset allocation that the Bureau's leaders stood inside a European ice sports changing area, unsealing an aluminum beverage adjacent to an executive loudspeaker, while a weaponized trespasser breached the southern estate? This did not constitute a fresh detail. Every factor within that inquiry had previously been presented, yet currently they stood merged, layered, and synchronized in a manner that eradicated division, cramming geography, activity, chronology, and accountability completely inside a single snapshot. Furthermore, for the initial occasion during the proceeding, zero prompt reply materialized, since at that juncture, every accessible reply failed to remedy the dilemma. It exacerbated it, avoiding mere verbal decay or partisan decay, generating architectural decay instead, since every potential rebuttal would validate an alternate iteration of the exact identical paradox already resting upon the ledger. Moreover, that represents the precise instant whenever an inquiry transitions from being a dialogue and morphs into an exhibition. Assuming Kash Patel claimed the estate crisis was managed sufficiently sans his attendance, he verified that he opted to linger in Europe whilst a defensive infiltration at the executive's domicile progressed. Assuming he downplayed the crisis, he shrank a logged weaponized trespass down to a level deemed unworthy of the immediate focus expected from the Bureau's leader. Assuming he highlighted faith placed upon his squad, he cemented that his bodily attendance remained elective, a fact which subsequently birthed the inquiry regarding exactly why the journey itself had initially been packaged as essential professional duty. Absolutely zero need escape existed, merely varying perspectives detailing the identical vulnerability. Moreover, that explains why the quiet carried weight heavier than whatever phrase that might have trailed it, since quiet amidst that framework does not equal emptiness. It represents the observable border defining whatever might be spoken without generating an inconsistency that might be authenticated. Chris Coons refused to break the quiet. He avoided pushing anew. He declined to reiterate the inquiry. He permitted the architecture he had constructed to bear weight independently, since every single component within it was currently laboring, The recording, the flight manifest, the surrendered schedule, the estate infiltration, the informant's declaration regarding the educational campus. As each fragment stood autonomous, each fragment proved certifiable, and collectively they forged an entity that demanded zero subjective translation to be grasped. This illustrates exactly what occurs whenever proof is deployed not to debate, but to restrict, skipping persuasion to instead constrain the volume of potential rationalizations until absolutely zero among them might endure without crashing directly against one another. This held true since whatever Kash Patel had supplied up until that juncture didn't represent a solitary rationalization. It comprised a chain: professional duty, short private interlude, supplementary conferences, tactical protection. Every stratum was tacked on following the preceding one-meeting resistance, with every stratum stretching the storyline exactly far enough to soak up the stress generated by the prior prompt. However, stretching carries a penalty, since every tacked-on stratum requires synchronization alongside the preceding ones, and by the hour the proceeding hit this juncture, synchronization was simply no longer achievable. The term professional duty had been reiterated quintuple occasions prior to the senator hitting playback, lacking aggression, lacking defensiveness, just delivered uniformly, as though reiteration independently might cement permanence, acting as though stating it sufficient occasions might forge it into the lens through which every other detail might be absorbed. However, reiteration merely functions whenever zero elements disrupt it, and whatever the senator presented wasn't a disruption regarding pitch, it served as a disruption regarding truth. The noise of that beverage unsealing accomplished a feat vocabulary fails to reverse. It crushed the gap separating what was claimed from what was executed. Furthermore, the moment that gap vanishes, the storyline is forced to endure strictly upon its independent internal logic. It failed to do so since currently the inquiry ceased being regarding if Kash Patel joined a conference in Europe, stopped being regarding if he possessed valid communication alongside regional police, and abandoned being regarding if a fraction of the journey possessed a formal objective. The inquiry morphed into determining what exactly the term professional was attempting to camouflage, and that represents a wholly separate classification of dilemma completely. This holds true since assuming professional duty encompasses an athletic changing area festivity, a golden medallion draped about the collarbone of the Bureau's leader, an executive telephone chat transmitted across a loudspeaker, and an alcoholic beverage cracked into that exact identical acoustic zone whilst the chief executive is talking. Consequently, the meaning itself has stretched past comprehension. Alternatively, assuming it hasn't stretched, assuming it perpetually keeps its traditional definition, consequently whatever was broadcast across that monitor utterly fails to squeeze within it. Absolutely zero tertiary alternative exists. That represents the foundational paradox, and the senator never required vocalizing that aloud, he never required defining it, nor did he ever require packaging it into a theoretical inquiry concerning the perimeters of civil service, since the proceeding wasn't functioning upon a tier of theory any longer. It was functioning upon a tier of logged conduct. February 21st, an arranged tour concerning the Unified Command Hub. February 22nd, an international ice sports match, an athletic changing area festivity, plus a recording depicting the Bureau's leader engaging amidst that revelry. February 22nd, a defensive infiltration occurring at the executive's estate. February 23rd, alongside the 24th, zero arranged professional engagements logged upon the surrendered schedule. February 24th, a homeward aviation journey back toward the American Republic. This doesn't constitute a storyline. This represents a chronology, and chronologies refuse to warp to humor vocabulary. They either synchronize alongside whatever gets asserted, or they reveal exactly where it fails. Whatever rendered this instant distinct from the multitudes of alternate interactions that occur within legislative inquiries annually rests upon the fact that it bypassed subjective translation to forge stress. It rested upon synchronization, and desynchronization represents a concept the mortal mind digests instantly. You don't require being an attorney, you don't require comprehending national aviation guidelines, you don't require grasping the administrative calendar habits belonging to the agency. You merely require acknowledging that whenever somebody claims one detail while a broadcast depicts a contrary reality, the onus transfers. It transfers away from the individual posing the inquiry directly toward the individual supplying the reply. Furthermore, that remains exactly where Kash Patel found himself, positioned at a desk beneath a pledge of truth, possessing a ledger crystallizing about him which he proved unable to alter, unable to repackage, and unable to retract. This reality held true since this didn't constitute a media briefing. This didn't resemble a broadcast journalism sit-down. Zero chance existed to detour toward a separate subject. Zero chance existed to shout down the prompt. And absolutely zero chance existed to inject a fresh storyline prior to the former one becoming thoroughly investigated. Every single element lingered. Every single element piled up. That represents exactly what renders a legislative inquiry distinct whenever it operates upon its peak tier, skipping elevated decibels, bypassing elevated theatrics, prioritizing elevated exactness. Furthermore, exactness serves as the mechanism that mutates disconnected realities directly into an architecture. The architecture stood sufficiently finished now that it avoided demanding extra stretching to endure. It demanded mere acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the rationalization supplied failed to mirror the conduct broadcasted, acknowledgement that the chronology supplied failed to mirror the schedule surrendered, and acknowledgement that the defense supplied failed to mirror the scenarios outlined. Plus, fundamentally vital, acknowledgement that this matter avoided being regarding visual perception, since visual perception might be waved away, visual perception might be repackaged, and visual perception might be blamed upon subjective viewpoint. This didn't constitute subjective viewpoint, this constituted hard logging. The broadcast had been witnessed by legions of citizens prior to it ever breaching the inquiry chamber. It had been authenticated by numerous journalistic entities. It had been dissected, argued, shielded, and lambasted. However, preceding that exact instant, it hadn't been inserted within the rigid architecture governing legislative scrutiny. It hadn't been broadcast beneath a pledge of truth, nor had it been coupled simultaneously alongside the formal rationalization supplied directly by the implicated department. That represents the distinction separating a trending clip away from a ledger. A trending clip might be endlessly debated. A ledger demands to be formally addressed. Furthermore, the second it transitions into a component within that ledger, its classification transforms. It proves immune to being filed away into obscurity, it proves immune to being recategorized, and it proves immune to being labeled as fragmented or stripped of background whenever the complete background has freshly been broadcast inside a chamber engineered to snag and safeguard it. It transitions into being immutable, and that immutable coordinate currently rested squarely amidst the core of the proceeding, rejecting the role of a diversion, rejecting the role of a tangent, standing instead as a baseline against which every subsequent declaration might be weighed. That explains exactly why the subsequent 30 minutes spanning the questioning, completely ignoring the substance, proved unable to revert the proceeding back to where it existed prior to the senator hitting playback, since the baseline had mutated. Preceding the recording, the proceeding functioned within the realm of rationalization. Following the recording, it functioned within the realm of paradox. Moreover, the moment that mutation occurs, every reply gets graded uniquely, skipping whatever it contributes, focusing entirely upon whatever it neglects to harmonize. That stands as the instant whenever a proceeding ceases focusing upon data gathering and initiates focusing upon liability. Furthermore, the second liability breaches the chamber, everything transforms, skipping the illumination, skipping the chair layout, skipping the sequence of talking heads, but completely altering the metric through which every syllable gets weighed. This rings true because liability fails to inquire if a situation might be rationalized. It inquires if the rationalization might withstand collision against truth. Kash Patel persisted talking following that instant. He replied to alternate prompts. He reverted toward drafted phrasing. He reclaimed rhythm, architecture, and recognizability. However, zero portion of that resurrected whatever had perished, since the lens had previously transitioned away from storyline dominance directly toward factual restriction. The broadcast ceased being a snippet floating across the web. It currently stood as a component belonging to the legislative ledger, coupled alongside a flight manifest, coupled alongside a surrendered schedule, coupled alongside sworn statements, and coupled alongside quiet. Furthermore, quiet within that environment avoids being impartial. It gets translated. 14 ticks lacking a reply toward a blunt inquiry concerning accountability amidst a defensive infiltration utterly fails to project as deep pondering. It projects as the void of a shieldable stance that might be articulated devoid of blowback. This holds true since assuming a neat rationalization existed, it would possess materialized instantly. That represents exactly how the dynamic functions across every tier of liability. Assuming the realities synchronize, the reply remains straightforward. Assuming the realities fail to synchronize, the reply stretches, stalls, mutates, conditions, and repackages. Moreover, whatever the chamber had freshly observed wasn't a stall of recollection. It stood as a stall of harmonization, specifically harmonization separating what got executed away from what got asserted. This holds true since the matter skips past if an individual might spectate an ice sports match. It skips past if an individual might breach an athletic changing area. It skips past if an individual might revel in a monumental triumph alongside the competitors who secured it. Those do not represent forbidden behaviors. Those do not even represent uncommon behaviors. Whatever renders this scenario distinct revolves around the mixture, the position, the chronology, the excuse. The leader of the nation's premier police agency flying aboard a state plane portrayed continually as executing formal duty, manifesting within an athletic changing area, sporting a golden medallion, cracking a beverage adjacent to a device transmitting the executive's vocals while spanning the identical calendar day. Weaponized person infiltrates the defensive boundary belonging to the executive's estate. That does not represent visual perception, that represents stark contrast, and stark contrast, whenever logged, compels scrutiny. This rings true since the citizenry refuses to digest the state via legislative paperwork. The citizenry digests the state via instances akin to this, instances wherein power, liability, and conduct materialize inside the identical snapshot. Upon a single edge belonging to that snapshot rests the concept concerning national police operating at its peak tier, primed, regulated, accessible, reactive. Upon the opposite edge rests an athletic changing area stationed in Milan, an aluminum beverage unsealing, a festivity that pertains to competitors, entirely separate from the formal mandates tied to the position that Patel occupies. Furthermore, wedged amidst those dual edges rests a single term, professional. Exactly what does it signify? Skipping the glossary definition, skipping the media dispatch, skipping the drafted remark reiterated quintuple occasions inside an inquiry chamber? Exactly what does it signify whenever it gets weighed against truth? This matters since assuming the meaning proves pliable enough to absorb every single element that transpired within that broadcast. Consequently, it ceases functioning as a meaning entirely. It operates as a shield. Conversely, assuming it fails to prove pliable enough, consequently the rationalization supplied toward lawmakers utterly fails to endure. That represents the boundary the proceeding struck, and it avoids being a factional boundary. It avoids being a liberal boundary or a conservative boundary. It stands as an architectural boundary separating whatever gets claimed beneath a pledge of truth away from whatever gets exhibited within hard proof. This explains exactly why instances akin to this carry weight far past the specific persons implicated, since they expose exactly how the apparatus reacts whenever those dual elements fracture apart. Does the apparatus swallow the paradox? Does it bypass it? Does it rationalize it into vapor? Or does it log it and abandon it for the citizenry to scrutinize? Chris Coons refrained from yelling, he refrained from alleging, he refrained from unleashing a final summation following the conventional blueprint. He executed a maneuver far more exact. He deposited the components upon the desk and permitted them to breathe collectively, entirely avoiding cramming them tightly into a solitary storyline. Subsequently, he uttered a concluding remark aimed at the ledger. On the 22nd of February 2026, whilst a weaponized individual proceeded to infiltrate the defensive boundary belonging to the executive's estate, The leader of the National Police Agency stood inside an athletic changing area stationed in Milan, Italy, cracking an aluminum beverage adjacent to a device transmitting the chief's vocals via loudspeaker. Zero modifiers, zero subjective translation, merely synchronization. That broadcast currently resides inside the legislative ledger. That phrase carries weight far heavier than whatever preceded it, since the moment an item breaches the ledger, it refuses to vanish whenever the proceeding concludes. It mutates into a sliver of the bureaucratic consciousness. It mutates into a sliver of the baseline meant for subsequent prompts, subsequent proceedings, and subsequent rulings regarding faith, liability, and trustworthiness. He rose upright, executing a gesture that broadcast conclusion, completely rejecting perpetuation. The national citizenry might formulate their independent deductions regarding exactly what professional duty resembles, and that does not represent dodging liability, that represents the handoff of it. This holds true since at that juncture, absolutely zero extra syllables demanded speaking to finalize the architecture. The reality stood previously synchronized, the paradox stood previously observable, and whatever remains pertains strictly to subjective translation. Furthermore, subjective translation within an apparatus that leans heavily upon civilian faith avoids being an idle function. It operates as the engine through which liability gets mandated. Prior to the mallet dropping, the broadcast had previously migrated past the chamber boundaries, trimmed, distributed, looped, dissected, and witnessed multitudes of millions of occasions. However, its classification had mutated. It ceased being merely a trending instance. It constituted proof that had been probed, displayed, and abandoned unaddressed amidst a rigid inquiry. Absolutely zero dispatch originating from the agency's press proxy possessed the ability to undo that reality. Zero refinement possessed the ability to erase the noise of that beverage unsealing atop the executive's vocals, and zero calendar rationalization possessed the ability to plug the vacant void spanning the 23rd of February alongside the early hours of the 24th of February. This remains accurate since the core dilemma skips past if rationalizations breathe. The core dilemma revolves around if they synchronize. Moreover, whenever they fail to do so, the void separating them mutates into the narrative. That specific void represents exactly where faith either endures or shatters. Consequently, the inquiry ceases being regarding what transpired in Italy, as that remains logged. The inquiry ceases being regarding what got asserted inside the proceeding, as that remains archived. The true inquiry focuses upon what metric governs whenever those dual realities crash together. Does the identical meaning regarding professional duty govern every single person? Does the identical mandate concerning attendance, liability, and prudence govern the individual perched at the peak of the agency precisely as it governs the operative stationed below him? Does the identical apparatus that monitors, probes, and punishes paradoxes committed by outsiders enforce that metric internally, or does the meaning mutate whenever the rank mutates? This matters since, assuming it mutates, consequently, the term independently hemorrhages meaning entirely. Furthermore, whenever vocabulary hemorrhages meaning within agencies constructed upon legislation, an alternate entity initiates decaying right alongside them. Avoiding immediate decay, avoiding visible decay within an isolated instant, but progressing steadily spanning instances akin to this, wherein the citizenry gets pressured to swallow a rationalization that completely fails to mirror exactly what they are able to observe and perceive independently. That fails to constitute a public relations dilemma. That constitutes a trustworthiness dilemma. Moreover, trustworthiness, the second it gets dragged into doubt upon this tier, refuses to reboot whenever the proceeding concludes. It trails directly into the subsequent inquiry, into the subsequent declaration, and into the subsequent instance wherein the citizenry gets pressured to believe that whatever gets asserted accurately mirrors whatever is genuinely transpiring. Therefore, whenever you perceive that noise anew, the pop of an aluminum beverage unsealing atop an executive vocalization, query yourself regarding exactly what it symbolizes. Skip the festivity, skip the match, skip the instant viewed independently. Exactly what does it symbolize whenever it gets positioned adjacent to the phrase professional duty and gets filed onto the ledger lacking a transparent reply capable of harmonizing the pair. Furthermore, assuming that prompt completely lacks a neat reply, exactly what does that scream regarding the apparatus that is mandated to supply it? Assuming you have viewed up until this mark, you previously comprehend exactly why this carries immense weight. Consequently, currently the floor belongs to you. Strike the approval icon upon this clip, assuming you trust that liability ought to completely ignore rank. Drop a remark underneath detailing your perspective. Exactly what does professional duty signify whenever the proof screams differently? Distribute this upload so a broader audience might witness exactly what got formally placed onto the ledger. Finally, subscribe to America in Focus for further dissections of the instances that avoid merely generating front pages, but rather carve out exactly what liability resembles whenever it gets challenged in active reality.